Welcome back to Minds of Murderers, a channel dedicated to examining the darkest crimes, the minds behind them, and most importantly, the lives that were stolen far too soon. If you're new here, thank you for finding this space. And if you've been with the channel for a while, I truly appreciate your continued support. Before we begin, I want to gently ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. These stories take time, research, and care to tell responsibly, and subscribing helps ensure they continue to be shared. It also helps amplify the voices of victims who deserve to be remembered for more than just headlines. Your support truly makes a difference. Today's case is one that is deeply unsettling, not just because of how it ended, but because of how ordinary it began. It's the story of a young woman who went out for a routine run and never made it home. A story that feels random, sudden, and terrifying precisely because it could happen to almost anyone. We are talking about 25-year-old Sydney Claire Sutherland. This case gained widespread attention because of its chilling similarities to other high-profile disappearances involving women who were attacked while running alone. And while I hate that these patterns exist, it's important that we talk about them. Not to spread fear, but to honor the victims and confront uncomfortable realities. Sydney's story is heartbreaking because there were no warning signs. No risky behavior. No indication that her life was in danger. She was doing something she loved, in a place she knew, on a day that began like any other. Cases like this remind us how fragile routine can be, and how quickly normal life can be shattered. They also raise difficult questions about safety, vulnerability, and the kind of world we live in, especially for women. But above all else, this is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about a daughter, a sister, a nurse, a friend, and a woman who was deeply loved. Sydney deserves to be remembered for who she was, not only for what was done to her. So today, we're going to tell her story with care, with clarity, and with respect. Let's begin by talking about who Sydney Sutherland was before everything changed. Sydney Claire Sutherland was born on September 18, 1995, in Jonesboro, Arkansas. She was the youngest child in her family and the only daughter, a role that made her especially cherished by her parents, Maggie and Dion, and fiercely loved by her two older brothers, Tyler and Sam. Being the only girl on both sides of the family, Sydney held a special place in everyone's heart, and those who knew her often described her as the glue that held the family together. From a young age, Sydney had a natural warmth about her. She was caring, selfless, and deeply empathetic, the kind of person who noticed when others were struggling and instinctively wanted to help. That compassion wasn't something she turned on and off, it was simply who she was. Friends and family described her as someone who loved unconditionally and lived life with an open heart. It came as no surprise that Sydney chose a career in nursing. Right out of high school, she pursued her licensed practical nurse certification and later went on to earn her registered nurse degree through ASU Newport. Nursing wasn't just a job for her. It was a calling. Caring for people, easing their pain, and showing kindness during difficult moments gave her purpose. One quote that perfectly captured Sydney's spirit was her senior quote, "The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away." Those words reflected exactly how she lived. Her gift was compassion, and she gave it freely to everyone around her. Outside of work, Sydney's world revolved around her family, especially her nieces. They adored her and lovingly called her Aunt Sassy, a nickname that matched her playful, lively personality. She was close with her parents, particularly her mother, Maggie. The two spoke often, saw each other regularly, and shared a bond that went far beyond a typical mother-daughter relationship. At 25 years old, Sydney's life was full and moving in a positive direction. She had a career she loved, a close-knit family, a committed relationship, and plans for the future. She was active, health-conscious, and passionate about fitness, especially running, which helped her relax and clear her mind. By the summer of 2020, everything in Sydney's life seemed to be falling into place. No one could have imagined that it was all about to be taken away in a single, unthinkable moment. August 19, 2020, was a Wednesday, and for Sydney Sutherland, it began like any other peaceful day off. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't stressed. She was simply enjoying her time. That morning, Sydney went to work out with her trainer, something she did regularly. Fitness was important to her, and staying active helped her maintain both her physical and mental well-being. After her workout, she visited her mother, Maggie. Even though they had just returned from a family vacation in Florida, Sydney still wanted to spend time with her. That was the kind of relationship they shared, close, constant, and deeply loving. Before leaving her mother's house, Sydney mentioned her plans for the rest of the day. She said she was heading home, planned to bake something sweet, cookies or brownies, and then go for a run. Maggie gently suggested she take it easy, pointing out that she had already worked out earlier. But Sydney loved running. For her, it wasn't about pushing her limits. It was about peace. Running helped her clear her mind and relax. Around 2 p.m., Sydney left her home for that run. She was wearing a white tank top, black shorts, and pink running shoes. That was the last time she was seen alive. Sydney lived with her boyfriend, Alex, in a rural farming area of Arkansas. Alex had already left for work, but the two had been exchanging messages earlier, so he knew roughly when she went out. At first, there was nothing unusual. Sydney often went for runs, and Alex didn't expect constant updates. But as time passed, something felt off. When Alex returned home around 5 p.m., Sydney wasn't there. That alone was alarming, but what truly raised panic was what he found inside the house. Her purse was still there. Her keys hadn't moved. In a rural area like theirs, there was no reason for Sydney to leave without them. Calls went unanswered. Messages weren't opened. That's when fear set in. Alex immediately contacted Sydney's mother, Maggie, asking if she was with her. She wasn't. Within moments, the realization hit them both: something was wrong. Very wrong. Sydney's father and brothers were contacted, and a missing person report was filed almost immediately. There was no waiting, no hesitation. Everyone knew that time mattered. A normal afternoon had turned into a nightmare. And as the sun began to set, Sydney Sutherland was still missing. Once the missing person report was filed, the quiet farming town of Atkins, Arkansas, changed instantly. News of Sydney Sutherland's disappearance spread fast, not through headlines at first, but through phone calls, text messages, and urgent knocks on doors. In a town this small, everyone knew who Sydney was. And everyone knew this was not normal. Law enforcement arrived quickly and began retracing her last known steps. Officers drove along the rural roads where Sydney was known to run, scanning ditches, fields, and tree lines. They looked for anything out of place: clothing, a shoe, a phone, any sign that could explain why a healthy, athletic young woman had vanished in broad daylight. Soon, volunteers poured in. Friends, family members, neighbors, and even strangers showed up to help. Some walked in organized search lines. Others drove tractors through nearby fields. ATVs combed through back roads and wooded areas. Drones were launched overhead, scanning the land from above. Search dogs were brought in, hoping to catch Sydney's scent. But as hours turned into days, hope began to mix with dread. One of the most unsettling discoveries came early in the search. Along the road Sydney often ran, searchers found a single item: her iPhone. It was lying face down near a ditch, damaged, as if it had been thrown or dropped during a struggle. The phone was still powered on. For investigators, this changed everything. Sydney wouldn't abandon her phone during a run. It was how she tracked her distance, listened to music, and stayed connected. Finding it like that suggested something sudden, violent, and completely unexpected. The search expanded immediately. State police joined local officers. The FBI was contacted. Helicopters swept the area. Roadblocks were set up, and investigators began canvassing nearby homes, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual that afternoon. A strange vehicle. A scream. Anything. Meanwhile, Sydney's family waited in agonizing uncertainty. Every phone call made their hearts race. Every passing hour felt heavier than the last. They held on to hope, but fear crept in quietly, relentlessly. This was no longer just a missing runner. It was becoming something much darker. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. By the morning of August 20th, investigators knew this case had reached a turning point. Nearly 24 hours had passed since Sydney disappeared, and the silence was growing louder by the hour. Then came a discovery that changed everything. Less than 1/10 of a mile from Sydney's home, along the same rural road she often ran, investigators found her cell phone. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't damaged. And it wasn't hidden. It was simply lying there. When officers examined the device, they noticed something chilling. The audiobook Sydney had been listening to during her run was paused mid-play. Not stopped. Not finished. Paused. This detail suggested one disturbing conclusion: Sydney hadn't chosen to stop. She had been interrupted. And based on where the phone was found, she was almost home. As investigators processed this discovery, witnesses began coming forward. One of the most significant was a UPS driver who had been traveling along County Road 41 that afternoon. He reported seeing Sydney running at approximately 2:30 p.m. She appeared normal. Nothing seemed wrong. But when the driver passed through the same area just minutes later, she was gone. That single observation narrowed the timeline dramatically. Investigators now believed Sydney had vanished within an 11-minute window. 11 minutes. In that brief span of time, a young woman disappeared from an open rural road without leaving behind signs of a struggle. Another witness soon came forward, a local farmer named Quake Llewellyn. He told investigators he had also seen Sydney running that afternoon and claimed nothing seemed out of the ordinary. On the surface, his statement appeared helpful. But as detectives reviewed the growing timeline, something about his account didn't sit right. His proximity to the area. His familiarity with the road. The timing of his movements. Individually, these details meant little. Together, they began to form a pattern. For the first time since Sydney vanished, investigators had more than fear and unanswered questions. They had a narrow window, a location, and a developing sense that this was no longer a case of someone simply disappearing. Something had happened to Sydney Sutherland. And the truth was getting closer. With the timeline narrowing and witness accounts aligning, investigators shifted their focus. What had once been a wide search was now tightening around a small group of possibilities. And at the center of it all was one name that refused to fade into the background. Quake Llewellyn. By this point, investigators had learned that Quake wasn't just a local farmer. He had prior experience in law enforcement and was, at the time, training to become a state trooper. To many in the community, that detail was unsettling. To investigators, it raised the stakes. Quake had placed himself near Sydney's last known location during the critical 11-minute window. He had come forward as a witness. He had participated in the search. And he appeared calm, cooperative, and willing to help. But detectives know that sometimes, the person who inserts themselves into an investigation isn't helping for the reasons they claim. Law enforcement decided to take a closer look. They requested Quake's phone records and location data. What they found was deeply troubling. Location tracking from his phone showed his vehicle turning around near County Road 41 around the exact time Sydney disappeared. The data indicated that he stopped for several minutes in that area before driving away at a high speed. This directly contradicted his earlier statements. Investigators then examined his truck. Inside, they discovered signs that could not be explained away. There was damage to the vehicle consistent with striking a person. More alarming still were traces of blood and indications that the interior had been cleaned recently. This was no longer speculation. It was evidence. With each new finding, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. Sydney hadn't vanished on her own. She hadn't wandered off. She hadn't suffered a medical emergency. She had encountered someone. Someone who knew the area. Someone who had the opportunity. And someone whose story was unraveling by the minute. By the end of that day, investigators knew they were no longer dealing with a missing person case. They were investigating a violent crime. And the search for Sydney had taken a devastating turn. Quake Llewellyn was quickly arrested and charged with multiple heinous crimes: capital murder, rape, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The weight of his actions was undeniable, and the community demanded accountability. To avoid the death penalty, Quake eventually pleaded guilty. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, in its formal sense, had been served. Yet for Sydney's family, nothing could truly undo the loss. Nothing could bring back the daughter, sister, and niece they cherished so dearly. In the courtroom, more than 60 people wore pink, Sydney's favorite color, as a powerful tribute to her life. Her mother, with incredible courage, faced the man who had taken her daughter, reminding him of the precious life he had stolen. Those moments were raw and emotional, a blend of grief, defiance, and love. Though the law had punished Quake, the pain of Sydney's absence remained, an unhealed wound in the hearts of all who knew and loved her. Her life had been cut short, yet her memory began to take on a life of its own, shaping how her family and community honored her. Since Sydney's death, her family and community have worked tirelessly to preserve her memory. Their actions ensured that her story was not defined by violence, but by love, compassion, and resilience. Pink crosses now mark the locations where Sydney was taken and where she was laid to rest. An overpass in the area has been renamed in her honor, a daily reminder to all who pass of her spirit and the life she lived. A foundation bearing her name has been established, supporting educational programs and community causes, continuing her legacy of care and giving. Each year, runners participate in memorial runs, finishing the distance Sydney never could. These events are more than remembrance, they are a celebration of her light, a testament that while her life was taken, her spirit remains alive in the hearts of many. Her story serves as a beacon, even in tragedy, love and community endure. Sydney took precautions. She was aware. She did nothing wrong. And yet, evil still found her. That is the most heartbreaking truth of all. By sharing her story, we remember her not for the crime committed against her, but for the life she lived, a life full of love, kindness, and laughter. Her story is a reminder to stay aware, stay connected, and trust your instincts. Sydney Claire Sutherland was a daughter, a sister, a niece, a friend, and a nurse who dedicated her life to caring for others. She mattered. She was loved. And her light continues to shine. Please remember Sydney. Honor her by staying vigilant, by cherishing your loved ones, and by spreading kindness in a world that can sometimes feel cruel. Thank you for listening, for keeping her memory alive, and for joining us on this difficult journey. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.